My in-laws convinced my husband to make me sign a prenup because they thought I was a gold digger. But when I got rich, they sued to get half. Some people treat a prenup like it is just boring adult paperwork you have to sign so everyone can relax. But for me, that stupid stack of pages turned into the most expensive trust exercise of my life. I am not exaggerating when I say that every time I hear the word agreement now, my eye twitches a little. If you had told me back when I was standing in that fancy office, holding a cheap pen and trying to look like a calm, mature businesswoman, that I was basically signing the script for the end of my marriage, I would have laughed and said something dumb like, "Oh, we are not that kind of couple." Yeah, about that. My name is Harper, by the way. I run a small online store that stopped being small somewhere along the way, but in my head I still see myself as the girl packing orders on her bedroom floor, with tape stuck to her jeans. When I met my ex, I was still in that early phase where everything felt fragile and temporary. I had a beat-up little car that I prayed would start every morning, a tiny apartment where the heat never reached the bathroom, and a website that barely pulled in enough to cover rent and cheap groceries. I worked part-time at a front desk during the day and packed orders at night, and my idea of treating myself was buying name-brand cereal instead of the generic one. We met at this dull networking event my friend dragged me to because there was free food, and she swore it would be good for my business. It was in one of those hotel conference rooms with the beige walls and bad coffee where everyone wears the same polite smile and hands out cards like they are throwing confetti. I was standing by the snack table pretending to be very interested in the cheese tray when he walked up and made a joke about how all networking events have the same sad vegetable plate. It was not a particularly funny joke, but I laughed anyway because I was tired and socially awkward, and his eyes crinkled in this friendly way that made me feel less like a stray who had wandered into the wrong room. He told me he worked in marketing for a mid-sized company that helped brands build a digital presence. I told him I sold specialty home products online and tried to say it confidently, like it was already a real business and not something that could still be killed by one bad month and a broken laptop. We started talking about websites, email lists, abandoned carts, all that nerd stuff, and suddenly everyone else in the room faded into background noise. He grabbed us 2 cups of coffee and we ended up sitting on the floor in the hallway because all the chairs were taken, just trading stories about nightmare customers and weird bosses. He asked for my number before I left, and I gave it to him even though I usually froze in those situations and pretended I did not really date. Which was a lie, by the way. I just did not date anyone long enough to justify buying a second toothbrush. He texted me before I even got home. Just a simple, "It was really nice talking to you tonight. Let me know if you ever want help with your site." I stared at that message for way too long, and then answered something casual that I rewrote 3 times so I did not sound desperate. We started texting every day, then calling, then going out for late-night burgers after our shifts. And before I even realized it, he had slipped into my life like he had always been there. Those first months felt light in a way my life had never felt before. He would show up at my place with takeout, sit on the floor and help me pack boxes while we watched random shows on my laptop. He fixed a few things on my website, helped me write better product descriptions, and gave me little tips that actually started to work. Orders picked up slowly, then a bit more. And every time I saw that new order notification pop up, I would text him a screenshot like a proud kid. He never made me feel silly about it. He would send back things like, "Look at you, businesswoman," or "This is just the beginning, you know that, right?" And I believed him. Meeting his family came later, after we had already been together for almost 2 years. He kept putting it off, saying they were busy or traveling or dealing with some drama with a rental property. And honestly, I did not push it because my own family was messy enough. My parents are the classic working-class couple who spent their whole lives tired. My mother did shifts at a nursing home. My father bounced between warehouses, and money was always something we whispered about, never something we had. They were proud of me in this quiet, confused way. Like they did not fully understand what I did, but liked that I looked serious when I talked about it. He, on the other hand, grew up in a world where money was like wallpaper. Always there, not discussed out loud, but controlling everything. His parents lived in one of those neighborhoods where the lawns matched, and every house looked like it had been copy-pasted from a catalog. They owned several rental properties, some kind of family business, and apparently they had paid for his first condo straight out, like it was nothing. He never bragged about it. If anything, he tried to downplay it. But it still seeped through in little comments about trips they took, investments they were making, or the way he never really panicked about bills. The first time he mentioned marriage, we were sitting on my couch eating takeout fries, watching some dating show where everyone was crying dramatically in ball gowns. He looked at the screen, then at me, and said, almost casually, "We would never do something that ridiculous, right? If we got married, it would be small and simple." I froze with a fry halfway to my mouth because that tiny word "we" hit me like a truck. I teased him, asked if that was supposed to be some kind of proposal, and he got flustered and started backtracking. So I reached over, grabbed his face, and said, "You are not getting out of this that easily. Finish the sentence." He laughed and said, "Fine. When we get married, it will be because we actually like each other, not because we need some giant performance." I did not say yes right then because there was technically no ring, no official question, but something in me clicked into place. I started to picture a life where I was not constantly counting pennies or wondering if I would have to move back in with my parents. Not because of his money exactly, but because with him, things felt less scary. Like I did not have to hold everything together alone. The real proposal happened a few months later at this little park near my apartment. Nothing extravagant, just him with a ring that clearly cost more than my car, and hands that would not stop shaking. I said yes, obviously. I cried, we laughed. Some random dog ran up and tried to steal the little box. And for a moment, everything felt so hopeful that I forgot people like me do not usually end up in houses with matching lawns. Announcing the engagement to my family was simple. We did it over dinner at my parents' place. Sitting at their wobbly kitchen table, passing around plates of food my mother had overcooked because she kept walking back and forth, wiping her eyes. My father hugged him, clapped him on the back, told him he had just signed up for all of us whether he wanted it or not. There was no talk of money, no conversations about rings or venues or guest lists. Just, "We are happy if you are happy," and "Do not forget where you came from." The good kind of cliche. Telling his family was a completely different show. We drove out to their house one evening, and the whole way there my stomach felt like it was folding into itself. He kept saying, "They are going to love you. Stop worrying." But it sounded more like something he was trying to convince himself of. The house was beautiful in that way that makes you automatically straighten your clothes. Tall ceilings, quiet halls, the kind of couch you are scared to sit on. His mother opened the door with a smile that looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. His father was behind her, already holding a drink. We all sat in their perfect dining room with the big table, the soft lighting, the expensive plates. At first it was polite small talk about work and the weather and how fast time goes. Then he cleared his throat, reached for my hand under the table, and said we had something to share. His mother's smile froze into something tighter the second he said the word, engaged. You know that heavy silence that falls right before someone says something they cannot take back? That is exactly what it felt like. His father blinked slowly, then took a sip of his drink, and his mother tilted her head like she was examining a stain on a shirt. She said, "Wow, that was fast," even though we had been together longer than some of their friends' marriages lasted. Then came the questions. Not the happy, nosy questions about dress colors or dates, but the kind that sound innocent if you do not listen closely. Have you two talked seriously about finances? Are you sure you are ready for something this permanent? What happens to the business if things change? Do you really think it is wise to get married while everything is still developing? They said developing the way people say unstable when they are trying to be polite. I tried to answer with a smile glued to my face, saying things like, "We communicate well," and "We have plans," even though the only plan I had was to survive each month without melting down. Inside, I could feel that old familiar shame crawling up my spine, the one that always whispered that I did not belong in rooms like this. My parents could not have been more different. They worried about me, sure, but they would never sit there and interrogate my boyfriend like he was applying for a loan. Their questions did not stop after that dinner. The next day, he called me sounding tense and said his parents wanted to talk about practicalities. I met them again, this time in some sleek office downtown that smelled like leather and old money. There was a lawyer there, a man in a suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, and a stack of documents on the table. His mother smiled like this was totally normal and said, "We just want to make sure everyone is protected. This is not personal." Spoiler, it felt extremely personal. That was the first time I heard the word prenup in relation to my actual life, and not in some celebrity article. The lawyer started explaining clauses in that dry, rehearsed way lawyers have, talking about separate property and marital assets and future business interests. The short version was, what we each owned before the marriage stayed separate. And my business, its name, its accounts, and even its growth, was listed as mine unless I voluntarily signed ownership over. At the time, they framed it like protection. Later, they treated it like an insult. I could feel my face burning. It was like being told very politely and with the best stationery that they thought I might be a gold digger. I glanced at him, expecting him to push back or at least look uncomfortable, but he just reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it like he was saying, "Please just go along with this," he said quietly. "This is just to make them feel better. It does not change how I feel." I wish I could tell you I stood up, told them all where they could shove their paperwork, and walked out in a blaze of self-respect. Instead, I swallowed hard, nodded like a good, reasonable adult, and said I needed to have someone on my side look it over. I know. You do not have to yell at me. I was in love and trying not to blow up the first real relationship that had not crashed by month 3. I found a lawyer through a recommendation from a friend of a friend. She met me in a small office that looked nothing like the marble palace his parents used. She wore flats and had tired eyes, and she talked to me like a person, not like a potential liability. She read through the document, asked me a bunch of questions about the business, about how much I made, about what I hoped to build. Then she sighed in that way people do when they are about to tell you something you do not want to hear. "Harper," she said, "this agreement favors him pretty heavily, especially given where your business could go. It is not the worst thing I have ever seen, but there are clauses here that could really hurt you if things go bad." "Do you think he expects things to go bad?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. She hesitated. "I think his parents are planning for every scenario that protects him and what they see as their family assets. I cannot tell you what is in his heart. I can tell you that you have every right to negotiate or to say no altogether." We went back and forth, made notes, adjusted a few things, and in the end I had something slightly less harsh but still clearly tilted in his favor. My lawyer said, "If you were my sister, I would tell you not to sign this unless you are completely sure, and even then, I would still be nervous." I nodded, took the papers, and went home where I stared at them on my kitchen table for 2 straight evenings like they were a test I had not studied for. In the end, I signed. I signed because I hated the idea of being the girl who said no and confirmed all their suspicions. I signed because he showed up with flowers and this nervous smile and said things like, "This will finally get them off our backs, and now we can just focus on us." I signed because I thought, in my naive little heart, that it would not matter, that we were solid enough that a piece of paper could not change anything. The wedding itself was beautiful in that slightly generic way weddings tend to be. A small venue, fairy lights, a dress that took up more space than my old bedroom. My parents cried the whole time. His parents smiled for the photos. People made speeches about love and partnership and trust, and for a while, things were exactly what everyone said they would be. The first years of marriage were not a disaster. Sometimes I think that is what made everything later feel so brutal. If he had been awful from the beginning, maybe I would have believed people when they tried to warn me. We moved into a small place he already had, the one his parents had helped him get, and slowly turned it into something that looked like it belonged to both of us. He lost his job during a restructuring at his company a little after we got married, which was scary at first but also kind of weirdly exciting because it meant he had time to help me with the business. He started handling logistics, packing orders, dealing with shipping issues, and talking to suppliers while I focused on product, marketing, and customer service. He joked that he had become my unpaid intern. I joked that he was the most expensive intern I would ever have. We stayed up late planning, making lists, arguing about silly things like which color of packing paper looked better. I paid most of the bills. He had a card linked to our joint account. His personal expenses were covered because I genuinely believed we were building something together. While he looked for new opportunities, it honestly did not bother me. It felt fair. I had income coming in, he was helping keep it all running, and we were a team. About a year into the marriage, the business blew up. It did not happen overnight. But when I look back, it feels that way. A video about one of my products went viral on a social media app, some bigger accounts shared it, and suddenly my order notifications were going off like an alarm. I went from packing a few orders after work to waking up to hundreds waiting in the queue. I hired my first employee, then another, then a small warehouse space that smelled like dust and possibility. We took out a loan to expand inventory. I signed contracts with distributors in other states. It was terrifying and thrilling and exhausting, and through all of it, he was there, handling spreadsheets and shipping labels and talking about scaling like it was the most natural thing in the world. Our life changed with the numbers. I wish I could pretend it did not, but it did. About a year into the marriage, we moved into a bigger house in a nice neighborhood. The mortgage and the title ended up only in my name because my credit score looked better on paper. The business income was technically under my name. I was the one making the down payment and covering every monthly payment, and the bank preferred dealing with one borrower when the income source was that clear. Later, when we sat in front of a judge, the records showed that almost every cent that had ever gone into that house came from my accounts, the kind where people jog in coordinated outfits and have opinions about mulch. We bought nicer furniture, upgraded things, started going out to restaurants where the menus did not have pictures. I was constantly reinvesting money back into the business, paying off debt, planning for the next step. The success felt fragile but real enough that I could breathe a little. That is when his parents suddenly started showing up again like they had just remembered we existed. They came over with bottles of wine, with housewarming gifts that looked suspiciously like things they would have liked for themselves, with comments about how proud they were. His mother walked through the house with this assessing gaze, making little remarks about the decor, asking how much certain things cost in that chirpy tone that made it sound like she was just curious, not cataloging. She made a few jokes about how the house finally matched their family standards, and I laughed along even as something in me tightened. She started asking more about the business too. At first, it was harmless stuff like, "Are you still getting all those online orders? And do you ever sleep?" Eventually, it turned into, "So, what exactly does my son do for the company? And, is he officially on the paperwork?" She said it lightly, like she was asking about weather, but there was this sharpness underneath. One afternoon, she asked if we could talk, just the two of us. We went out to the back patio, the yard perfectly trimmed because apparently that was now my life, and she sat down with this serious expression that made my stomach flip. "You know we care about you," she said, like she was delivering bad news. "We are very proud of how far you have taken this little idea of yours. But we also have to think about the future, for the family." Whenever people like her say the family, what they actually mean is our side of the family, primarily the male child we raised. She told me that since her son was working in the business full-time, it made sense for him to be added as an official owner in some of the accounts and assets. Not everything, of course. Just enough to reflect reality. She talked about how things would look on paper, about potential future investments, about liability and protection. I listened with this numb feeling because I already knew where this was going. I explained as calmly as I could that the company structure was already set up in a way that worked, that we had legal and financial advice, and that adding him as an owner would change a lot of things, including my relationship with the lenders and with some partners. She smiled tightly and said, "Harper, you have to understand it is not about taking anything from you. It is about recognizing his contribution." Then she brought up the prenup, casually, like she was mentioning a funny story from a vacation. She said it was written at a time when nobody imagined the business would become what it had become, and that maybe, just maybe, it was time to rethink some of those terms. I remember staring at her and thinking, "You made me sign that, and now you want to undo it because it is inconvenient?" I told her that I was not interested in revisiting the agreement or changing ownership structures right now, especially not because she felt uncomfortable. Her eyes hardened in this way I had only ever seen when she talked about people who took advantage of the family. She said, "I hope you are not forgetting how much support my son has given you." That night, I told him everything. I expected him to be on my side, to say something like, "They are out of line, I will talk to them." At first, he did seem annoyed, said they were being extra, that he did not want them stressing me out. But over the next few weeks, his tone started to shift in this subtle way that is hard to prove but easy to feel. He started asking more pointed questions about money. Not just, "Hey, how did we do this month?" but, "Do you think it is fair that everything is still in your name?" He asked for access to certain accounts, just so I can help keep track, and wanted to sit in on calls with the accountant, even when they were about things he did not usually handle. Every time his parents came over or he got off the phone with them, he seemed a little more distant, more defensive, like he was carrying their voices around in his head. One night, after we had gone back and forth about whether he needed login information for some of the business accounts, he looked at me and said, "Do you not trust me?" And the way he said it, low and hurt, made me feel like I had just kicked a puppy. I tried to explain that trust and legal structure are not the same thing, that just because the business is in my name does not mean I do not see us as a team. He said, "You keep saying that, but on paper it looks like you have everything and I have nothing." I reminded him gently that the prenup was his parents' idea, not mine. He muttered something about protecting me from my own bad choices and walked away. The turning point, the moment when everything really snapped, was a dinner that he forgot to tell me his parents were coming to. I had been working a long day, dealing with a delayed shipment and a temperamental new hire, and I came home ready to just eat something simple and fall into bed. Instead, I opened the front door and heard his mother's laugh from the dining room. The table was set nicely, There was some kind of casserole in the oven, and 3 additional place settings waiting for me like a trap. I pasted on a smile, hugged them, made small talk, tried to pretend I was not furious. Halfway through the meal, his father put down his fork and said, in that deliberate way older men do when they want your full attention, "We have been talking about something." My ex cleared his throat and glanced at me. "Yeah," he said. "We thought it might be good to discuss the prenup and some changes to the company structure while we are all here." I looked at him, then at his parents, then back at him. "At dinner?" I asked. "Without telling me?" His mother waved a hand like I was being dramatic. "We are all adults here. These things happen around the dinner table all the time." They started talking over me. His father talked about risk and equity. His mother brought up my early days, how I had once mentioned wanting to quit when things were hard, and used that as proof that I was impulsive and needed someone steady, like their son on the paperwork. My ex nodded along at the parts that made him look good, and conveniently went silent at the parts that made me sound flaky. Something inside me snapped. I put my fork down, looked his mother in the eye, and said, "You demanded that prenup when you thought I was going to be a financial burden. Now that the business is doing well, you want to get rid of it because it benefits your son less than you expected. Which is it? Am I a risk, or am I a meal ticket?" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. His mother's face flushed. His father's jaw clenched. My ex hissed my name under his breath like I was a child acting out in public. He called me selfish. He said I was letting my ego ruin the family. He said things like, "I was there when your business was nothing," as if I had forgotten how many boxes I packed alone before he ever showed up. I got up from the table shaking, told them I was done talking about it, and left the room before I started screaming. After that night, something in our marriage shifted into a place it could not easily come back from. He started monitoring expenses more closely, questioning my decisions both at home and in the business. He took it upon himself to manage our joint account, which quickly turned into him freezing certain purchases, and then accusing me of being reckless when I pushed back. He had a call with our accountant without telling me, tried to discuss potential restructuring, and the accountant, bless him, called me to check because he could tell something was off. I came home one afternoon and found that my home office had been rummaged through. Papers were out of order, a drawer that I always kept locked was slightly open. When I confronted him, he said he had just been looking for a document and that I was overreacting. We had another ugly fight, this one ending with him packing a bag and leaving to clear his head at his parents' house. The quiet that followed was almost worse than his yelling. For a few days, I went through the motions like a ghost, running the business, eating takeout, staring at my empty bed. I kept expecting him to walk back in, apologize, admit his parents had gotten into his head. Instead, I got an email from him asking if we could meet at a coffee shop to talk like adults. When someone says talk like adults, what they usually mean is, "I am about to drop something on you and I want you to promise not to make a scene." We met at a crowded place near my warehouse. He showed up in a button-down shirt that looked too crisp for someone who had supposedly been thinking. He sat down, ordered black coffee even though he hated it, and pulled a folder out of his bag. My stomach sank. "I talked to a lawyer," he said. "I think it is time we make some changes that reflect reality." Inside the folder was a proposed revision of our prenup, or more accurately, a request to completely throw out the old agreement and replace it with something that gave him half of everything I had built since the wedding. Half the company, half the house, half the assets, half the future. He said he thought it was fair because he had been working with me and sacrificing his own career to support mine. He said in plain words that he did not want to be the guy who walked away with nothing if we ever split, that he wanted a guarantee the money would not stay entirely under my name. I stared at him like he had grown a second head. "Did you come up with this, or did your parents?" I asked. He bristled. "This is about us, not them. I am tired of you acting like I cannot think for myself." I closed the folder, slid it back to him, and said, "No." He blinked. "We can negotiate. We do not have to do it exactly like this." "No," I repeated. "I am not tearing up a legal document your parents forced me to sign just because they realized it benefits me more now. I am not changing company ownership to make them sleep better at night. If you feel you need to be compensated, we can talk about salary and bonuses like normal adults. But I am not giving you half my business on paper because your parents do not like the current math." His face hardened in a way I had never seen before. "So that is it?" he said. "You get everything, and I get nothing?" I wanted to scream that he already had so much more than I did when we started, that he had years of security and support I could not even imagine. Instead, I just said, "We both know that is not true. But if you are going to stand in front of me with a document drafted by your lawyer and act like I am robbing you, we have a bigger problem than paperwork." He left angry. A few days later, the whispers started. It began with vague posts on social media from his mother about people who use others and then act like victims. Then a distant cousin of his commented something on one of my business posts about treating your husband like an employee. Someone I barely knew mentioned at a networking event that they had heard things about how I was freezing him out of the business he helped build. None of them said anything directly to me. It was all smoke and implication, poison spread carefully. Word travels fast when you work in a niche industry where everyone goes to the same networking breakfasts. Apparently, one of his cousins knew someone on their finance team. At a networking breakfast, a woman who ran a similar business pulled me aside after a panel and gently asked if I was okay, which would have been wildly inappropriate even if we lived in a small town and not a city where people normally mind their own business. She said she had heard about instability in the leadership and wanted to make sure my company was not about to implode. I smiled so hard my face hurt and told her everything was fine, that personal issues were separate from professional ones. That night, I sent a calm internal email to my team. No gossip, just clarity about who approved payments and who talked to clients. I refused to let their mess become my brand. Inside, I wanted to throw something. At home, things got rough. He moved back in, but not really back in. He slept in the guest room, spent hours on his phone, and only talked to me about schedules and bills. We could not seem to have a calm conversation about anything. Every attempt turned into a fight about trust, control, money, or his parents. He blamed me for making him choose between his family and his wife. I pointed out that I was also his family and had been for several years. I stopped sleeping properly. I started jumping every time my phone buzzed, half expecting another passive-aggressive post or some new rumor. I kept my laptop with me everywhere. I locked my home office. I checked the company accounts obsessively. I changed every password that night, called the bank the next morning, and removed his access from anything tied to company money. It felt paranoid. It was survival. It felt like I was under siege in my own life, and all I was doing was trying to keep what I had built from being rewritten as ours only when it suited them. Eventually, I hired a lawyer of my own, someone who specialized in business and family matters. She listened to everything, from the prenup to the pressure to the folder at the coffee shop. Then she said, "You need to protect yourself. Now." She sent a formal letter to his parents and to him, asking them to stop spreading misinformation that could damage the business and warning that further actions would have consequences. They responded by filing a lawsuit. Within the same week, my lawyer filed for divorce. No dramatic "we will see" separation, just paperwork, deadlines, and a temporary order keeping him away from my business accounts while everything played out. The official claim was that he was owed compensation for his contribution to the business, and that I had unjustly enriched myself using his labor. They suddenly had detailed lists of tasks he had performed, hours he had supposedly worked, strategies he had allegedly created all by himself. His parents were named as witnesses to how much he had given up for me. Reading the documents felt like reading fan fiction about my own life, written by someone who hated the main character. My lawyer explained that even with the prenup, they could still try a kind of unjust enrichment angle, arguing that his hours in the business made him entitled to a payout. It depended on the state and the judge, so we could not just waive the paperwork and walk away. The case forced us into a process where both sides had to share information. My lawyer asked for their financial records and communication about the business. That is when the curtain finally started to slip. Because they had stepped in as the ones backing his case and were named in the filings as people funding it, my lawyer was allowed to pull parts of their financial records into discovery as well. It turned out his parents were in worse financial shape than they had ever hinted. There were debts, late payments, properties hanging by a thread. They had been trying to move some assets into his name quietly, probably to keep them out of reach if things went south. My lawyer pointed out that if they managed to get their hands on part of my company too, it would give them something solid while everything else was crumbling. There was also an email. There is always an email. During discovery, buried in the flood of emails their lawyers had to turn over, was a message from him to his mother, from the early days of our arguments about the prenup revisions. In it, he admitted that he felt awful pressuring me but did not know how to tell them no. He wrote that I had treated him well, that the business was mine, that he worried they were asking for too much. His mother replied with a guilt-trip masterpiece about family loyalty and sacrifice, and how men sometimes have to do unpleasant things to secure the future. Reading it felt like someone had punched me and then handed me an apology note for later. By month 3 of the lawsuit, it had been filings, mediation sessions, and miserable hallway conferences before we even got in front of the judge. There was one early hearing where I honestly thought I was going to throw up in front of everyone. Their lawyer asked for a temporary order that would have put an outside manager over parts of my business until things were resolved. The judge did not grant it, but having my company talked about like a piece of furniture they might divide later shook me more than I expected. When we finally had our day in court, his family walked in like they were the injured party in a soap opera. I walked in with a stack of documents and the kind of exhaustion that sits in your bones. My lawyer argued that he had been compensated through our lifestyle, through the fact that all our living expenses had been covered, that he had never gone unpaid or unsupported. She pointed out that there was no contract making him an employee or partner, and that the prenup, which his side had insisted on, specifically protected separate property like my company. Their lawyer tried to paint me as ungrateful, controlling, manipulative. They talked about love and partnership and sacrifice, which was almost funny considering who had pushed for everything to be written down in legal language in the first place. The judge listened, asked questions, and then, very calmly, started asking the kind of questions that made their story fall apart on its own. The judge looked at that email and asked my ex in front of everyone if he had felt pressured by his parents. He stuttered. His mother's face turned a shade somewhere between rage and panic. The judge asked why. If they believed he was an equal owner, they had never bothered to formalize that on paper until after the business became profitable. There were no good answers. In the end, the court rejected their claims. Completely. The judge said there was no basis to rewrite ownership retroactively just because one party's family wished they had negotiated differently. On top of that, the court ordered them to cover a large portion of my legal fees because the judge called it what it was: an opportunistic claim filed with no contract and no ownership paperwork. I wish I could say I felt victorious walking out of that building, but the main thing I felt was empty. I had spent so much time and energy fighting, defending, proving. Even winning felt like crawling out of a fire with most of your things burned. In the weeks and months that followed, as I tried to process everything, news started trickling in through mutual acquaintances. Their financial issues caught up with them soon after. Properties were sold off or taken. The family business closed. I heard through mutual acquaintances that their lifestyle shrank fast and hard. There were stories about auctions, about downsized apartments, about friends who stopped answering their calls. My ex sent me a few long messages around that time, full of apologies and what-ifs, and "we used to be a team" speeches. He said he regretted letting his parents get in his head. He said he had never planned to actually hurt me, that he had just wanted things to feel fair. He said he thought because we were married that my success was automatically his too. I read every word and then answered one time. I told him that wanting fairness does not mean you get to rewrite history or ownership just because your side miscalculated. I told him I was done being the soft landing whenever his family made bad financial decisions. Then I blocked him. A few weeks later, the divorce was finalized, and the only thing we still shared for a while was a last name I could not wait to drop. Phone, email, social media, everything. No dramatic goodbye, no maybe someday. Just a clean, sharp cut. I made the decision to sell the big house, because the mortgage and deed were already under my name alone, and the records showed I had covered almost every payment. The house itself was treated as mine in the divorce, with a modest payout to him folded into the overall numbers instead of the clean half he had imagined. It held too many echoes of slammed doors and hushed arguments and his mother's perfume. A few months later, once the paperwork and the sale were actually moving, I left. I bought a smaller place in another city. For a while, I split my weeks between the new place and the warehouse, until I finally moved operations too. Still nice, but quieter. Somewhere nobody knew the whole saga unless I chose to tell them. I kept building the business, hired better help, set real boundaries between my work and my relationships. A funny thing happened once the legal dust settled. I started getting messages from women at networking events, from other small business owners, from acquaintances I barely knew. They told me stories about their own situations, about in-laws who tried to control everything, about partners who suddenly became very interested in paperwork once money showed up. Some of them cried. Some of them laughed bitterly. All of them said some version of, "I thought it was just me." With some of the leftover money from the legal fees their side had to pay, I started supporting a small program that offered legal and financial advice to women starting businesses. It felt like the closest thing to justice I was going to get, turning their attempted grab into something that helped people they would never think about. The weird part is that after all the dust settled, daily life did not suddenly turn into some inspiring movie montage with upbeat music and me laughing over coffee in slow motion. Mostly it was me waking up way too early, staring at the ceiling, and trying to remember if there were any more court deadlines or emails I had forgotten to answer. My body kept expecting another attack, another letter, another dramatic text, even when nothing was actually happening anymore. I would be in the middle of answering a simple email about inventory, and my heart would start racing like someone had just knocked on the door with bad news. My parents were relieved when everything was formally over, but they were also quietly furious in that particular way parents get when they watch their kid walk into something they never fully trusted. They never said, "We told you so," mostly because they never had. They had not understood the prenup, or the legal details, or the fancy language. They had just always had a bad feeling about how small his family made me feel. After the case ended, my mother came over one evening with a casserole she swore she had just thrown together, and then sat at my kitchen table picking at her plate like she was the one on trial. She finally said, "I hate that they made you feel like you had to prove you were not after their money when you were the one building something all along." Her voice cracked halfway through, and I realized she had been carrying her own version of this whole mess in her head, full of what-ifs and guilt and imaginary conversations where she said the perfect thing at the perfect time and saved me from myself. My father, on the other hand, did not bother pretending to be calm. He kept pacing the kitchen, hands on his hips, muttering things under his breath that I am pretty sure would have gotten him kicked out of that courtroom if he had said them there. At one point he stopped, looked right at me and said, "If any of them ever show up here, you call me first. Not the police. Me." I laughed, because there was something both comforting and ridiculous about my father thinking he could physically fight off a whole family of entitled people with nothing but his work boots and pure rage. But inside, it meant a lot. He had not been able to protect me from signing that paper, but he wanted to protect me from everything after. We had this long, messy conversation about money and pride and how different our worlds had been. He admitted that when I first started dating my ex, a tiny part of him was relieved because he thought I might finally have an easier life. Not because of who my ex was as a person, but because of the cushion his family had. He said, "I am not proud of that, but I am not going to lie about it either." And there was something strangely healing about hearing that out loud. It made me feel less foolish for having had the same thought myself, even if I never wanted to admit it. I also had to clean out the big house before putting it on the market, and I underestimated how brutal that would be. It was just stuff, technically. Furniture, dishes, clothes we barely wore. But each room held a version of me I did not really like revisiting. The bedroom where I had rehearsed speeches in my head about boundaries and then chickened out. The kitchen where his mother had criticized my knives and called them starter tools. The dining room table where that awful prenup ambush dinner had happened, still bearing a faint ring from the glass his father had slammed down too hard. One afternoon I was in the bedroom sorting through drawers, making piles of what I wanted to keep, what I wanted to donate, what could just vanish, when I heard the front door open. My heart jumped into my throat because I had double-checked the locks. But of course, he still had a key. He called my name down the hall in that hesitant way that said he did not know which version of me he was about to meet. I had forgotten he still had a key left over from before I changed the locks on the office, and clearly he had not gotten around to giving this one back yet. I thought about not answering, just staying quiet and letting him walk around the empty rooms until he got the message. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "In here," because apparently I enjoy making things harder for myself. He walked into the room and stopped when he saw the open drawers and half-packed boxes. For a second, we both just stared at the same pile of tangled clothes like they were going to jump up and offer to mediate. He looked tired in a way that was different from when we were still fighting. The anger had burnt down into something smaller and sadder. He asked if I needed help, and I almost laughed because the last thing I wanted from him at that point was assistance choosing which of our old towels I was emotionally ready to keep. We ended up talking anyway. Not the screaming, hot kind of talking we had been doing for months, but that slow, stumbling kind you do when there are way too many words and none of them seem good enough. He said he did not expect his parents to push things as far as they had. He said he thought they were bluffing with the lawsuit until he realized they were not. He said he felt like he had been standing between a train and a wall and picked the one that yelled louder. I listened because I am apparently incapable of fully shutting off the part of me that wants to understand people, even after they have tried to strip my life for parts. I told him very clearly that understanding did not mean forgiving, and that sympathy did not equal a do-over. I told him he had a dozen chances to put the brakes on their nonsense and chose his own comfort every time. He did not argue with that. He just sat on the edge of the bed we used to share and nodded like each word was a weight landing exactly where it belonged. At one point he asked, "Do you ever miss when things were good?" And I hated that the honest answer was yes. Of course, I missed the version of us that ate fries on my old couch and made fun of reality shows. The one who packed boxes with me late into the night and made me feel like I was not crazy for dreaming bigger than my situation. But missing who someone used to be does not mean you ignore who they chose to become. I told him that too, and his eyes shut for a second like he was bracing for impact. When he left that day, he handed me his key without me having to ask. That tiny bit of awareness did not erase what he had done, but it did make it a little easier to breathe in that house while I finished packing it up. I also started seeing a therapist, which felt very cliché but also very necessary. I found someone who did not care about my emails, my legal documents, or my carefully curated version of events. She kept asking annoying questions like, at what point did you first feel small around them? And when did you first decide that keeping the peace was more important than your boundaries? I told her about my parents and their quiet pride, about walking into his parents' house and immediately adjusting my posture, about signing the prenup because the thought of being seen as difficult made my skin crawl. We dug into all the times before him when I had swallowed my own discomfort to be the good girl, the helpful one, the one who did not make waves. Turns out this whole saga was not born the day I signed anything. It was just the biggest, most expensive chapter in a pattern I had been rehearsing my whole life. That realization was both depressing and freeing. Depressing because, great, I had apparently been training for this disaster since childhood. Freeing because if it was a pattern, it meant I could actually do something about it instead of pretending I had just gotten unlucky. In between therapy and running the business, I threw myself into that little program I had started for women entrepreneurs. At first, it was mostly an excuse to feel like something good had come out of all this chaos. But it slowly turned into one of the few parts of my week that made me genuinely happy. We held small workshops in a shared community space, sitting in mismatched chairs with bad coffee and piles of printed handouts, talking about contracts, pricing, and how not to undersell yourself just because you are scared people will walk away. The program stuck. One evening, a younger woman stayed back after everyone else left. She was probably in her early 20s. Nervous and apologizing for taking up my time before she even started talking. She told me she was thinking about going into business with her boyfriend, that his parents wanted them to formalize some things before they invested, and that there was talk of paperwork she did not really understand. She laughed nervously and said, "I know it is not the same, but your story kind of freaked me out." I did my best not to project my own trauma all over her situation, but I did tell her, very clearly, to get her own lawyer, her own advice, her own space at the table. I told her not to sign anything she did not fully understand, and to pay attention to how people reacted when she said, "I need time to think about this." The relief on her face when someone finally told her it was okay to pause instead of rush was almost painful to look at. I realized at that moment that if I had heard someone say those things to me a few years earlier, I might have walked a very different path. There were still setbacks, obviously. Healing does not move in a straight line. It moves like a toddler holding a marker near a white wall. Some days I woke up ready to conquer everything. Other days I accidentally found one of his old shirts at the back of a closet I thought I had already emptied and ended up sitting on the floor crying into fabric that smelled like a life I no longer had. Some nights I scrolled too far back in my own photos and had to slam the phone down like it had burned me. And then there was social media, that distant echo chamber that somehow always finds a way to reach you. His mother posted a few more ambiguous messages over the months, little digs about people who play victim, and the emptiness of material success. My thumb would hover over the comment box more times than I want to admit. I would type long responses, delete them, rewrite shorter ones, delete those too. In the end, I never posted anything. Not because I did not have words, but because I finally understood that nothing I said there would change anything in her head. It would only drag me back into a fight I had already won on the ground that actually mattered. Real life, the one where bills still show up and clients still expect orders on time, kept pulling me forward. My team at work grew, and with it, my ability to delegate without feeling like I was about to lose everything I had built. We moved into a bigger warehouse with better lighting and worse parking, and I actually signed the lease under my own name without feeling like I needed someone else there to validate it. The first time I saw my company name on the door of that space, just mine, not ours, not the family brand, I had to stand there for a minute and let myself feel proud without immediately coupling it with guilt. Every once in a while, news about my ex would drift into my orbit. A mutual friend would mention running into him at a smaller apartment complex. Someone would say his parents had moved into a more modest place and were adjusting. I stopped asking for details. Not because I did not care at all, but because I cared too much and it was not healthy. I did not need play-by-play updates on the consequences of choices I had already stepped away from. Knowing they had to live a more normal life felt like enough cosmic balance without me having to track their every inconvenience. There was one last strange loose end that tied itself off almost by accident. I was at a local market one weekend, wandering past stalls of handmade candles and jewelry, when I spotted his cousin at a distance. She had always been the least unbearable of his extended relatives, mostly because she actually worked for a living and had once whispered, "I think you terrify them in the best way," to me at a family dinner. I considered ducking behind a display of scarves, but she had already seen me and was making her way over. She hugged me before I could decide whether I wanted her to. Then she stepped back, looked me straight in the eye and said, "They still tell the story like you ruined everything, you know." I raised an eyebrow because of course they did. She shrugged. "But people pay attention. They saw the court records. They saw how hard they went after you when things got bad on their side. It is not landing the way they think it is." It was oddly validating to hear that without having to ask. She told me she had started her own little side business recently, and that watching me fight for my company had pushed her to take herself more seriously. I joked that I was just trying not to drown, and she said, "Yeah, well, you accidentally taught a few of us how to swim while you were at it." I went home that day feeling lighter than I had in a long time, like some invisible weight I had been carrying for other people's opinions had finally slid off my shoulders. I also rebuilt pieces of my personal life in quieter ways. I started saying no more often, not as a dramatic performance, but as a simple, steady boundary. No to events that were more about appearances than connection. No to relationships where I felt like I had to earn basic respect. No to any situation that required me to shrink so someone else could feel bigger. It was uncomfortable at first. Saying yes had been my default setting for so long that no felt rude, even when it was completely reasonable. One of the first real tests was an email from a company that wanted a partnership, that basically meant slapping my product under their name. Old me would have smiled, thanked them for the opportunity, and negotiated myself smaller so nobody would call me difficult. I stared at the email for a long time, typed one line, "No, but I wish you luck," and hit send before I could talk myself out of it. My hands were shaking. Then nothing exploded. The world stayed standing. My life did not crumble just because I said no. That did more for my self-respect than any pep talk. It was not suddenly glamorous or exciting. It was me, in a smaller house with a cluttered kitchen table and a business that kept demanding my attention, figuring out who I was when I was not bending myself into shapes for someone else's comfort. It was imperfect and occasionally lonely, and still, somehow, better than any fancy lawn I had ever walked across pretending I belonged there. Before anyone asks, yes, there were a few disaster attempts at dating in between all of this. Because apparently my brain looked at the wreckage of my marriage and went, "Sure, let us see what other chaos is out there." I downloaded a dating app one night after too many glasses of wine and way too many episodes of a show where everyone met cute in grocery store aisles. I made a profile that was half honest, half, "please do not be weird," and started swiping through a sea of badly lit bathroom selfies and men who thought listing their height was a personality. The first person I went out with was a teacher who spent the entire dinner talking about how his ex had ruined his trust in women forever, which is definitely not what you want to hear when you are sitting across from someone trying to decide if you will ever let them see your kitchen. The second one was an accountant who seemed great on paper but kept making jokes about how nice it must be to have all that divorce money lying around, like I had walked away from a game show instead of a court battle that shaved years off my life expectancy. I realized very quickly that I was not actually ready to seriously date anyone. I did not trust my own radar yet. Every time someone was overly charming, I flinched. Every time someone mentioned their family, I wanted a full background check and a signed statement that their mother would never ask to see my financials. Instead of pushing myself into a new relationship just to prove I could, I finally gave myself permission to press pause. To figure out what kind of partner I would even want if I was not secretly auditioning to be accepted by their parents. I made a list one night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cheap notebook and a pen that leaked a little ink on my fingers. Not a list of physical traits or hobbies, but things like, does not see me as a project, does not panic when I say no, does not treat my success like a threat or a prize to claim. Seeing those lines in my own handwriting was sobering. It reminded me how low my bar had secretly been set before, how much I had mistaken bare minimum decency for some kind of romantic grand gesture. I also reconnected with myself in stupid little ways that sound cheesy until you actually do them. I went back to hobbies I had dropped because they did not feel productive. I started baking again just for fun, not for any content or brand tie-in, And there was something oddly healing about measuring flour and sugar when so much else in my life had been unmeasurable chaos. I went on walks without headphones, letting my brain wander wherever it wanted without immediately stuffing it full of business podcasts or self-help audio. My friendships shifted too. During the worst of the legal drama, some people had gone quiet, either because they did not know what to say or because my mess made them uncomfortable. A few of them came back around later with apologies and explanations. Some did not, and I decided not to chase them. The ones who stayed, the ones who dropped off food at my door and sat with me while I sorted through paperwork, became less like optional background characters and more like chosen family. We started having more honest conversations, not just about relationships, but about money, fear, and the weird pressure to always look like we are handling it. One close friend admitted she had almost signed a business loan with her boyfriend as a co-signer just because the bank employee made it sound easier. Another said her in-laws were pushing her to quit her job to focus on the home since her husband made enough, even though she loved what she did. Hearing their stories made me realize how many women are constantly negotiating invisible contracts they never got to write. My situation was messier and louder because lawyers got involved, but the quiet versions are everywhere. I used to think I needed their approval for the story to feel finished, like if his mother ever admitted she was wrong, or if he ever found the perfect apology, then maybe my chest would finally unclench. But that is not how it works. The finish line was me choosing silence over their chaos and choosing my name over their family. I kept the business. I kept my boundaries. I kept my peace, even when it felt unfamiliar and too quiet at first. He did not get half of what I built. His parents did not get to rewrite the math, and I did not get stuck being the villain in a story where I was the one who did the work. And that stupid stack of pages they treated like a weapon? In the end, it did exactly what I should have demanded from the start. It protected what was mine.